What was the real cause of the Georgia shooting last week that left 8 people dead, 6 of whom were Asian women? As the media scrambles to find the cause, we have to ask ourselves if they're missing a crucial insight. Welcome to Staying Grounded, where we turn from ideas to real-world events and issues. Monday's video touched on what psychoanalyst Slavoj Žižek refers to as the logic of the obsessive. The logic of the hysteric is characterized by telling a truth in the guise of a lie. The obsessive claims it's telling the truth, but it's really a truth that serves a lie. Today, we look at the horrific Georgia shooting spree that left 8 people dead to see if Monday's video might be able to help us understand the cause. People are looking everywhere for the blame, and for good reason. These types of events appear senseless. Without logic, they defy our expectations. But if we peel back the layers a bit, then we can begin to understand a little. Much has already been said about the rise of anti-Asian hate in recent months, so I'm gonna leave some resources below so that you can go ahead and learn more about that. I wanna concentrate on another angle. Not to dismiss anti-Asian hate as a central factor, but I want to add another dimension. Something with which I'm intimately familiar. As some of you know, I was raised in the church. I was training to be a pastor and a theologian, and I've since moved away from evangelicalism. It's this experience that gives me a unique perspective on something that's not getting the attention that it deserves.
He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction, and sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places, and it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate.
So why would these women be a source of temptation? Well, first of all, women have long been dehumanized by Christianity. This is what drives all those times you hear men talking about the victims of misogynist crime, that they shouldn't have placed themselves in those situations to begin with.
What did she expect to happen at 1 a.m. in the morning after sneaking out?
They had a history. They had consensual sex in her San Francisco apartment, allegedly.
Why should you wear makeup in the workplace? Isn't that sexually provocative? Why do you make your lips red? Because they turn red during sexual arousal. How about high heels? They're there to exaggerate sexual attractiveness. That's what high heels do.
This narrative places the blame on women, who are viewed purely in terms of how they are viewed by men.
Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at.
Which means they are viewed as objects. But this ties to a second problem, because not only are they viewed as objects, but they are sexualized and therefore viewed as sexual objects. And since women are sexual objects, men are repeatedly warned that if they don't eliminate the sin in their lives that is tempting them to violate God's law, then they will face further punishment or possible ultimate punishment in separation from God in eternal torment. Hell.
Jesus preached fire and brimstone. We're going to preach fire and brimstone.
This creates a pathological pattern whereby the sinner shines a light on his inward desires, and then that light reveals that all such inner desires are wrong.
I live in terror of judgment, this righteous judge who damns us, threatening us with the fires of hell.
The more you shine the light, the more the sin appears, which requires then more light shining, which intensifies the sin even further, and this creates a perpetual and building experience of one's inner state. And of course, that inner state is bad, which leaves the only solution to kill the sin. Quite literally. There's even a famous book written by Puritan John Owen called The Mortification of Sin. That is, the killing of sin.
Set faith at work on Christ for the killing of your sin. His blood is the great sovereign remedy for sin-sick souls.
Therefore, if sin is to be killed, and the source of that sin, that temptation, is identified in an external object, then one must do everything one can by taking radical measures to cut off the source of that temptation. Now, we know that the shooter was involved at his church's youth ministry. According to reports, he used to carry a Bible to high school with him every day, and he was described as a good, if quiet, church boy. So, with the shooter declaring that he identified the source of his temptation in these Asian women, we can deduce that he viewed them as the objectified source of temptation. And in his troubled mind, the only way to fix what he perceived as being a moral failure in the eyes of God he had to take drastic action and kill the source of that sin. Looking back to Monday's video, much like Nazi Germany's blaming of the other, the shooter was unwilling, maybe even unable, to actually identify the true causes of his anxiety and trauma. And instead, his fear drove him to a type of frenetic obsessive control. In this case, violence, as the shooter was trying to control what he perceived to be an out-of-control sin nature. If I can get personal for a minute, I recently had a little cousin commit suicide, 17 years old. Outwardly, he was the perfect son. Good student, great athlete, well-behaved. We were all really excited to see what kind of man he would grow into. In his suicide note, he made repeated references to the fact that he felt that he was never good enough. He could never live up to the standard of perfection that was set before him. While he didn't explicitly blame the church, he did mention heaven and how the thought of suicide was the only thing that brought him peace. He even expressed frustration and confusion and asked how God could place us into traumatic life circumstances.
When somebody leaps from a burning skyscraper, it's not that they're not afraid of falling anymore. It's that the alternative is so awful. And so then you're invited to consider what could be so awful that leaping to your death would seem like an escape from it.
Now, when I first heard about the suicide, I was angry. Not at Andrew. Not at my cousin. I was angry at the church. What makes me angry is that he was in pain for such a long time, and he had no real outlet to express that pain. Precisely because the narrative of the evangelical church so often fans the flames of discontent and stokes further guilt, which then disallows one from being able to find any sort of real peace. It creates that light that we just mentioned that is the source of shining light onto these supposed dark inner desires. And then worse, it gives you the interpretation that those desires are inherently bad. So it is the source that exacerbates the problem itself. And it teaches young men to be ashamed of their impulses. And this produces a toxic shame, one that leaves you with very few options. I have a friend who recently spoke about his experience coming out of the closet. Growing up in a very machismo environment in Brazil, he never knew that he was gay. To be gay meant to want to be like a woman, to wear dresses and such. But he didn't want to wear dresses or makeup or whatever, so he really had no framework for understanding his discontent. He simply felt like he didn't belong in the world. It wasn't until he moved to a progressive country that he was able to acquire certain resources that allowed him to be able to find a voice. I think there's something similar going on here that relates to my cousin's suicide, and also that we can apply to the Georgia shootings. Namely, that neither of these young men were able to be adequately adjusted to their inward desires. These desires were simply experienced like raging storms without any hope for finding peace. Now, of course, I don't want to conflate all of these different anecdotes. They clearly are different, but there is a commonality that I do want to draw us to, and it's this: that neither my cousin nor the Georgia shooter were adequately equipped with the linguistic and social resources that would have allowed them to be adjusted to the chaos that they felt within. But if I can encourage you, I just want to say that you are enough. Well, what does this mean? I don't fully know, to be honest. I'm still working on it myself. But at least it means this: the way that we build the fortifications in our hearts and our minds to protect ourselves from our traumas and our guilts and our shames and our fears can be perpetually rebuilt. We aren't slaves to some sinful nature, and neither are we immune from deep, dark emotional traumas. Like ships floating on stormy seas, we must keep rebuilding plank by plank, not ignoring the crashing waves and the tumultuous shifting winds. And we can't find a one-size-fits-all solution to navigate through the storm. But we can learn to read the weather patterns and the stars. We can update our maps, and we can chart new trajectories while repairing the leaks that breach our fortifications. So how to close? This is heavy stuff, I know. I'm going to provide some resources below so that we can continue the conversation. These will be links about anti-Asian violence, the rise of misogynist violence, toxic shame, etc., etc. But I just want to reiterate that you are enough. And if you are struggling, I sincerely hope that you find the support support you need to give you voice. So what do you think? Was the Georgia shooter motivated by anti-Asian hate, toxic shame, misogynist violence? Something else that we haven't discussed in this video and that the news isn't covering? Comment down below and let's see if we can help each other make some sense of this senseless tragedy.